I studied literature originally. I did a degree in English literature and language. After I finished my degree, I didn't really know what I wanted to do the summer after I finished. I'd always really enjoyed researching, reading, writing, and the historical context of literature had been something that I had focused on throughout my degree. After the summer after I graduated, I sort of had an epiphany and realised that the other thing I'd always really loved was clothes, and especially old clothes. I'd always loved charity shopping and buying second-hand clothes. So I started working at a vintage clothing shop company, and I became the buyer quite quickly because I was spending my lunchtimes reading books about history and researching. While I was there, I went back to school to do a master's degree in history and culture of fashion at London College of Fashion. While I was there, I started teaching the undergraduates as well. That was part of my master's. So I went back to school and I did a master's degree in history and culture of fashion at London College of Fashion. And I started doing my own work, my sort of own research after that. I did the visiting research fellowship at University of the Arts London. So it was kind of between St Martin's and London College of Fashion. And I've been an associate lecturer at LCF sort of on and off ever since. So I guess that was really sort of how I got into it.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. Kim, did you want to put forth the next question?
So my next question for both of you is there any part of your career and or experience that was particularly impactful or motivating with your work?
Sure. I mean, I kind of, to finish off on the training aspect, I guess I really feel like I mean, what I did was I researched the history of tailoring in 19th century Paris, and I was in Parisian libraries and museums, but I didn't really have a community. And so I actually did reach out to now Professor Christopher Bird at London College of Fashion and just said, you know, hi, I really like your book. I thank you. And he invited me for a conference at London College of Fashion. And that's when I really kind of realized that there was this amazingly sort of vibrant community of fashion scholars out there. It was my first contact with them. And they were so generous and welcoming. And I met many like sort of people who've become mentors like Professor Carolyn Evans there, and they were just so sort of warm and welcoming. And that's when I knew I could really be part of this field. And so then I got a job teaching at the Winchester School of Art. And I again had these amazing mentors, people like Barbara Berman, Leslie Miller, Judith Atfield, and they really showed me the ropes. And we did things like taking master students on field trips to Manchester. So I learned a lot about textile history and heritage, but also that's when it kind of, the germ of this project, Fashion Victims, was kind of happened, because I saw that the harm that fashion could do to the bodies of makers of fashion. And so that was a really kind of key experience for me, actually going and physically like experiencing that and seeing it. And then I guess, yeah, as I kind of went along, learning to work more and more with objects, and kind of what stories they could tell me by kind of interacting with them. So that was also super important. And then I guess finally, what I've really, we can talk about it more, but what's been really interesting to me as I go forward in the field is sort of collaboration, not just with kind of fellow traditional academics, but also with curators, with creative practitioners. So those things I can talk about more, but yeah, that's been pivotal for me, I think, collaboration and kind of community.
Thank you.
I think collaboration and sort of working within different fields is probably key to my answer here in many ways as well. Some of the most recent work, the sort of most recent field I've been working in is forensics, which I've spoken to all three of you about in the past. And so that for me was and continues to be a real eye-opener, because it's working within such a completely different environment to the sorts of environments I'm used to working in, whether it's universities and art schools, or whether it's museums, or whether it's the broadcasting or media work that I do. So that was incredibly impactful in terms of making me think about the work that I do, but also more importantly, the work that other people do on a day-to-day basis. And it's something I guess we're thinking about now at the moment, when, especially in this country, and I'm sure all over the world, we're currently really assessing what it means to be a key worker, and what that actually, what that means. And so I guess, when you're working with CSIs, working with people in forensics labs, working with police, it's such a completely different environment, and it really broadens your horizon in terms of work practices and work outcomes, I suppose.
Yeah, and you lead us in perfectly to exactly why we asked both of you ladies to join us together today, because I know, and some of you might have picked up on what they were just saying, that your current trajectory of your work, both of you, overlaps a little bit. So we would love to hear about exactly what you both are working on, and I know that you've spoken to each other about this a bit as well. So we would just like to invite you perhaps to tell us about what you're working on, and to converse with each other about those overlaps.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to. I got to hang out a bit with April, not with, I haven't gotten to hang out with you, but I've gotten to hang out with Amber in the UK while I was doing some archival research last year for a big project. My previous project, Fashion Victims, it follows on, just to give a bit of context, because I was looking at things which are all too unfortunately relevant now, like things like how clothing could be used to transmit contagious disease, or how it had toxins like arsenic or mercury in it, and how it could harm the makers and wearers, things like accidents, fire, but also like innovative technologies to combat these hazards, which again, I think I've been thinking a lot about with masks and personal protective equipment and gloves and things like that now. But I guess, yeah, that the kind of, especially the part on arsenic, and working with my physics department and testing artifacts and things like that, that got me interested in forensics, because I realized very early on in researching the arsenic chapter that the same kind of tests that were being developed to detect poison in bodies in the 19th century were being used to test poison, or to test textiles as well, to see if there were problems with them. And in fact, they were finding arsenic in both. And arsenic was a really important, if you like that, kind of really dangerous poison in the 19th century. So I realized there was this overlap between kind of the science and medicine and forensics, and kind of what was happening in the sphere of fashion, which you wouldn't kind of make that connection necessarily easily. And then I was like, it kind of sat on the back burner while I worked on this project. And then basically when I kind of thought, what's my next big project? This was it, right? I was sort of like, okay, let's really investigate the links between clothing and crime. And in fact, it's what I find interesting about it, at least from a historical point of view, is that most people who study crime history, and even the field of forensics, is very gendered. It's very male, masculine. Whereas, and so they don't, the kind of founders of forensics in the late 19th century and early 20th century took clothing very seriously. And of course, it appears in like all the Sherlock Holmes stories, footprints, like all of these sort of things that the crime history and forensics people weren't necessarily thinking of now. But like now I'm having trouble narrowing it down, and kind of, clothing is implicated in different ways in almost every kind of crime. So so I applied for a big federal grant with Elizabeth Semmelhack, who's the senior curator and creative director of the Bata, because we're going to do an exhibition as well called Exhibit A, which is, I'm super excited about. That's probably going to open next February. But anyhow, I look forward to talking to Amber. I mean, we felt like such a niche interest, but I think that there's so much to be said, and there are other people who are working on this. Some of you are probably here today. Thank you. But yeah, it's been a really interesting journey, and I've kind of, right now, the three themes I'm looking at are sort of clothing as weapon and protection, kind of in the street, accessories, and how people use them often to defend themselves or to as a weapon. Then also how clothing can be a clue or evidence. That's kind of maybe the most forensic of the chapters, and how early forensic pioneers kind of what they read from clothing, how they used it, and then the last is on sort of disguise and kind of both undercover policing and also criminal disguise.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm at.
It's so fascinating. I'm sorry.
No. I was just going to say this leads perfectly into something that you are practicing, daily, really.
Yeah. Well, firstly, I just like Alison's work is so fascinating, and I've actually always enjoyed Alison's work. Where even when I was doing my master's, one of the really key things I read that helped me with my dissertation, which was not at all in this area, was your Decorated Men article, Alison, looking at French military uniforms and women of fashion, which really helped me when I was working on my dissertation. And so I've just always, I just love everything you do. It's just all so fascinating. And with the clothing and crime stuff, do you have any idea when that book might be coming out?
I'm working on it. I've published a little article in the journal Costume called First Impressions on footwear evidence. Specifically, it was for the special issue for June Swan on shoes. So that's kind of like the first published thing. But the book the exhibition will come out first. It's kind of, that's what happened with Fashion Victims, just the timing of it. So in a way, focusing on footwear, we have some amazing artifacts coming for that too, that I've been looking at in places like the Scotland Yard Crime Museum, the Paris Police Museums and Archives. So yeah, I've been finding things for it, but the book will probably take another 2 or 3 years, and it will come out with Bloomsbury, who I worked with and I love working with.
Fantastic. And just in case anyone isn't aware, that Scotland Yard Crime Museum, it's also sort of colloquially known as the Black Museum here in the UK, and it's impossible to get into. It's not a public museum. And so the fact that Alison got in there for research is really, really phenomenal. I'm still trying to get in there myself. Haven't made it yet. But so the work that I've been doing in forensics was completely unplanned, basically. I was approached by a man, Dr. Carl Harrison, who has a company called Electro Forensics, and he had been discussing with someone from the National Crime Agency here in the UK about really the sort of the ecosystem of forensics here in this country, and how there is such a sort of overwhelming focus on DNA, which makes sense because it's, it completely revolutionized crime detection, and it's such an incredibly important innovation technology that we have. But there was a bit of a concern that the other items that could be used as evidence were really sort of falling from favour, and especially the sort of focus on stuff, essentially on material culture. And they had been looking through the National Crime Database records and realised there hadn't been somebody there associated with textiles and clothing for a really, really long time. The last person they had on the database was a tailor, I think from the late 19th century or something. So it was like a really long time ago. He subsequently heard me talking on the radio about a few various different areas to do with sort of clothing and communication and things like that. And sent me an email saying that he was looking for someone to work with on specific cases. So it's sort of case by case, the work that I do when it's relevant. When helping sort of identify and date clothing or textiles that's found with remains can be of use in terms of the whole picture of sort of forensic evidence, basically. So it's never really going to be the case in the work I do that the information I provide is going to necessarily lead to a conviction or lead to a total identity, but it can be a very important part of the overall picture, of the overall evidence, to sort of build up who that person was or what happened, all of the different scenarios, basically. So that's part of the work that I do with them, which will involve going into the lab, examining anything that gets, the items that get sent through, photographing, recording, in great detail, and then going away, doing some additional research and writing a report. The other part of the work that I do is training. So electroforensics run a number of training courses for crime scene investigators who are sort of moving up a level, I guess, in their careers. And when they run these courses, they'll get me in for half a day to run a session with the CSIs looking at clothing and textiles, really just to sort of bring about an awareness of how these things can be used as evidence. And just, because clothing is just, for so many people who don't think about clothing every day like we do, clothing is just seen as something incidental, as like almost part of the ether, part of the atmosphere, part of the air, especially if it's clothing, everyday clothing like sportswear or a t-shirt and jeans, for example. So it can very easily get dismissed. So my work with the training is to sort of let them know that one white t-shirt can be vastly, vastly different from another white t-shirt. And that all of these items, no matter how sort of everyday they are, can tell us very important stories and can give us a lot of very useful information.
That's fascinating. Sorry. Go ahead.
I had one last question for you both, and you've kind of touched on it in some various ways. And so one thing I'm thinking about is the people who are joining us today, maybe established scholars or their students, or just fashion enthusiasts. And so you both seem to have found a niche for yourselves. And so this is almost like an advice question also, and a little bit speculative. I'm curious, now that you've kind of found this niche, what can these roles or the work that you're doing make possible to really kind of help show some of our viewers what is possible in kind of finding a unique, a niche for yourself as a scholar?
Super. Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to respond to a little bit of the stuff that the kind of the content that that Amber was talking about, and I guess what I would say too, Amber, thank you for that. I think it's so interesting. I see you as almost one of these kind of pioneers in or kind of throwbacks to these early forensics people who didn't have DNA, as you said, so rightly said. Like, they couldn't rely on that particular technology until well into the 20th century. And so, Sherlock Holmes, for example, solves more of his mysteries, more of the crimes through footprints than even fingerprints, which were a new technology at the time. So something like a footprint could, again, in narratives, that might be the clue that tells you, that unravels this whole kind of mystery. But I guess one of my favorite kind of forensic pioneers, he was an art photographer, and he was a Swiss kind of guy who had a background in physics and chemistry, but he was also an art photographer. And his name was Rodolphe Archibald Rice, and he has this amazing archive of photographs of objects, many of them clothing objects, and he's doing things like ballistics tests on them, and things that we kind of think of as part of this CSI panoply, but he's literally shooting the murder weapon at someone's clothes. Like, it's very interesting and exciting, or kind of trying to match up textile weaves and some of the things that happen now. And this is in 1907, right? This is really early 20th century. But he said, we have to become philosophers in the mystery and matter of clothing. So I just love that. And there's a lot of, also, it's not just their knowledge as kind of scientific experts, but they often, what I think is interesting, is consulted with the makers of clothing, like the shoemakers, the hatters, the tailors. Like, they needed to know more from the makers and sellers of clothing to really help them solve these crimes, or at least figure out more about them. And it tells us a lot about working class dress as well, what people had in their wardrobes every day. Like you said, it's it's the equivalent of the t-shirt or the athletic clothing. It's the everyday wear that people appear in these crimes for the most part. So I think that's an important window in, like a new window into the history of dress that I think we can have. But in terms of your question, Kim, about, I suppose, what we have to kind of offer, I suppose, and then kind of how to approach things differently. I guess I would say, I think just in a way follow the word clue, which I didn't know. The word clue comes from a ball of yarn. It's a textile thing. You follow the clue. So I guess you got to follow that clue, and often it's a textile clue for me. Like, to me, this whole project and kind of my whole career has felt like a really exciting journey to refine and recover and unravel the role that clothing has played in so many aspects of our lives. And I think that's what this field has to offer. We can really look at things in new ways through this lens. And so I would say follow whatever interest you have. You can follow it through that through that textile kind of clue.
Yeah, I completely agree. And also, just to go back to like answer some of what Alison said before I get on to your question, Kim, is that so Alison mentioned we did some sort of research trips together last summer, which was fantastic. And getting to talk through these ideas, you know, all of your research and everything is something that I really am hoping we can spend some time doing more of in the future as well. One of the things you recommended to me was the Museum of, I think it's the Museum of Police and Crime in Sydney, where they have those incredible crime, the photographs. And I actually went there. I got to go there in January. I was in Australia and I went to see them. We should try and circulate the images somehow after this discussion, because the photographs that are taken are just absolutely incredible. They look like fashion photographs. And it was a whole series of pictures. Alison, I think you know more about this than me because you actually went into the archives. I just saw what was in the museum. But these photos taken of sort of potential criminals, people they thought had been involved in crime, and it's in the 1920s in Sydney. So everyone just looks amazing. They're wearing their sort of like plush hats, and the men are all dressed like gangsters. But there is just also such sort of like raw humanity in these photographs as well, which look very, very different to the sort of photographs we have today. So thank you for that recommendation. That was fantastic. In terms of the niche, I completely agree with what you said, and I didn't know that actually about Clue coming from textile, but I love it. That's amazing. I think I completely agree. I think that dress history or dress, fashion studies is really, you can use it as a portal to anything. You can use the study of clothing as you can tie it with sort of any other discipline really to provide more insight, which is why I always find it so frustrating when dress history, not so much now, but certainly a lot in the past, that gets marginalized a lot within sort of academic studies. And I mean, we see that the marginalization of fashion as a topic within popular culture all the time. It often gets dismissed. People think it's superficial. People think it's trivial. And I just disagree so strongly. And that's been a thread that I've really tried to have running through all of the work I do, especially the public facing work that I do. And like with the TV series A Stitch in Time, one of the things I really wanted to do was show people how clothing can be such a useful portal to the past, how we can understand clothing, understand the past better if we use clothing to investigate it, because we still all wear clothes. We still all get dressed, even people who claim not to be interested in, fashion or, getting dressed at all. They still have to put clothes on because it's kind of the law if you're going to leave the house. And so you can use it to not only investigate the past, but also, as Alison was saying, using it to, through the focus of sort of crime and crime records, to really understand the areas around working class dress and the manufacture of dress. So many different areas. You can look at technology, you can look at the economy. It's endless. And I know I'm very much preaching to the converted here in present company. But I think there is you just find your niche, because there are just still so many unexplored areas. My initial work didn't, the forensics thing for me is really quite recent and was very, very unexpected, but I'm thoroughly enjoying it and researching the whole area. But for me, my initial sort of niche was looking at nautical clothing, which I started doing during my master's degree at London College of Fashion, hence the Decorated Men article, and eventually became this book, Nautical Chic, which was out a few years ago. And that came from a very personal interest in having grown up in a coastal town in the UK and just really being fascinated, like loving the aesthetic of the seaside here and the clothing that goes along with it, and just being fascinated by why naval styles, sailor styles are so often on the catwalk. So that's what that niche grew from, was from a really personal, specific interest. So yeah, just follow what your interest is, and there will be a niche for you.
Exactly, and I think fashion offers such unique opportunities. Like Amber, you've spread. I mean, I love showing your videos to my students. They're thrilled to see them, and I love, like, so there's television, radio. We now co-founded a journal at Ryerson called Fashion Studies, which is open access, and there are lots of other venues like that. Same thing. I never thought, Deadly Fashion would be a kid's book, but I co-wrote Killer Style with a friend who had a fashion magazine called Worn, Sarah Marie McMahon. So like, there's so many possibilities, and I have to say, I mean, again, preaching to the converted, but I found in my experience that the sort of skepticism that people often, or kind of dismissive attitude, immediately often gets replaced with fascination and curiosity too, because it's sort of like, well, wait, I hadn't thought of that. And I love seeing that moment happen actually as well. And it was very funny because when I was first researching the Decorated Men article in the Army Museum, Musée de l'Armée, so this big institution where like the Republican Guard was on parade almost every day. It was this 17th century building, this very old, kind of institution in Paris, and the curator was a bit perplexed by me. I remember going into the library, I'm this sort of young grad student, and he was sort of like, oh, it's really interesting to have you here. Like, most people come in here to study, like a flintlock, pistol from, this particular year. You're studying fashion. They were very, very kind of intrigued. And then they started bringing me sort of more and more things that related to fashion and uniforms, like caricatures of soldiers that I ended up using, brushing their horsehair plumes or putting makeup on themselves, and kind of looking at the soldier as a fashion plate, which, I don't think they'd ever thought of. And then I had the really interesting experience of going back there in December, and there was an exhibition called Canon de l'Élégance, so Cannons of Elegance, and it was all about military fashions with all the accessories, swords, jeweled, like, plumes, uniforms. It was amazing. And I was like, okay, so it took a little while, but now this is actually happening in the Army Museum, which was like the dustiest, fustiest place. So so it was exciting. It's exciting to see that.
That's brilliant. And we really saw that happen actually in one of the research trips we did last summer. We went to the Thames River Police Museum, which is this great tiny little place on the Thames. And the guy it's a sort of volunteer guy that used to be in the Thames River Police who runs it, who's great. And the longer we were there, the more he was just, he was like, oh yeah, actually, and I've also got this, and actually I've also got this. And there is that real sort of sense, you're right, that realization that like, oh yeah, actually, yes, there is, this is everywhere. This is, this is important. Yeah.
Definitely. I went and gave a conference paper in December in Lausanne, where this early pioneer was, and I was sort of like, how can we use the archive differently? And so they had, an art historian, they had forensic experts, and I was sort of part of that. And they're like, look at this new way of approaching this archive by looking at clothing. It's actually really interesting. And so I was very nervous about it, but they were incredibly welcoming and fascinated as well, and helpful. So so that's pretty exciting. That's the best part of my job.
That's great. I also find that when I go in to do these CSI training sessions, actually, the first time I did it, I was really, really nervous. I felt really out of my depth, and I also felt really overdressed. I don't think I was actually, I think I was dressed pretty similar to how I am now, which normally I don't think twice about, because I'm spending my time in, art schools and et cetera, et cetera. And suddenly I was like at the head of Surrey Police, and I just felt so inconspicuous, and was really the first time in a very long time that I was really had a heightened awareness, not in a good way, of the way I was dressed, which was really, I haven't felt that way probably since I was a teenager, and you just feel awkward all the time anyway. But as soon as, and I could sense there was like a little bit of suspicion initially, people kind of like, what is she gonna, tell us? What use is this gonna be? But by the end of it, it was everyone had completely opened up, and like one guy was telling me about his collection of vintage Hawaiian shirts, and like everyone has a story, you know, everyone has a story about clothing. Often it's to do with people's parents, or, you know, oh, my so and so left me this, or I still have this, or my wedding dress, or, you know, everyone has these intimate emotional relationships with certain items of clothing, and suddenly that all starts coming out, and it's a really lovely process.
April?
Yes.
Ugh, gosh, I feel like we could go on and on and on. It's so hard to tie these conversations into 30 minutes, and this was getting also very therapeutic, also just learning stories, because many of us experience the same thing when we get people to open up about our kind of sartorial stories. But Amber and Alison, where can we follow your work? Where can we find you?
I've had a lot of people contact me on Instagram, which I use more for personal reasons, but on Twitter, I'm at A Matthews David, MATTHEWS, and then David. I usually try to post work things there. So, and we're also doing, just so you know, please submit. We've postponed it another year. It's going to happen in October 2020. There's going to be a conference at the Bata Show Museum and at Ryerson University called The Fabric of Crime. So, and we have Jo Turney, who's coming from Winchester to be our keynote, and she just published a book called Fashion Crimes. If you're interested, I highly recommend Fashion Crimes if this is something that interests you. But yeah, follow me on Twitter, I would say, would be the best place to find ongoing things.
I am also on Twitter at Amber Butchart, but I would say the opposite, and I would say probably follow me on Instagram, because I'm much more active on Instagram than I am on Twitter. Twitter gets a little bit shouty for me, but Instagram I'm much better at, and I'm just at Amber Butchart there, so you can find me there. Yeah.
And Alison, I loved your book recommendation there. Amber, might you have something that you'd like to recommend to everybody that's at home for foreseeable future?
A book recommendation. Oh, well, I mean, I do have here, as I keep holding up, I mean, I would just really recommend this. This is Alison's book, Fashion Victims. I hope you can see that. I posted this on Instagram last night as well. That's what I would really recommend. It's fantastic, and just such amazing like illustrations all the way through as well, from a number of different areas. I've just been researching a piece that I write quite regularly for Freeze magazine online, and I've just recently been researching a piece about the intersection between medicine and textiles, which hopefully will be coming live soon, and I will disseminate on all social media once it is. But it's a similar, in some ways, similar sort of mix of dress and science as well. Like, I really had to get my head around a lot of science to be able to write this piece and to interview the textile artists that I spoke to. But similar to this, there is so much really fascinating but really accessible science throughout this as well. And it's that intersection of sort of arts, dress history, and science that I'm really, really finding fascinating at the moment.
All right, we are about out of time for today, but ladies, thank you so much for joining us on our very first getting to know you.
Thanks so much for organising this, both of you. And can we do one where you guys are talking as well, because your work is so fascinating, both of you.
Perhaps we'll get to it one day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.